And can I welcome everyone to the 16th meeting of the Education and Skills Committee. Can I please remind everyone present to turn their mobile phones and other devices onto silent for the duration of the meeting. The first item of business is a decision on whether to take a number of items of business in private. Firstly, is everyone content that item 6 of this meeting is in private? Yeah, thank you. There are a number of items in the first week back that I am proposing we also take in private, and they are listed on the agenda. They are consideration of 2 draft reports and an item on the committee's work programme. Is everyone happy that these 3 items are in private at the next meeting? Thank you very much. The second item of business is a session on the Scottish Government's draft budget 2017-18. This session will cover the draft budget and also the committee's pre-budget scrutiny of SDS, SFC, Education Scotland and SQA. And I welcome to the meeting John Swinney, the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, Olivia MacLeod, Director for Children and Families, and Aileen McKechnie, Director of Advanced Learning and Science for the Scottish Government. Good morning. I understand the Cabinet Secretary wishes to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. I welcome the opportunity to give an opening statement in relation to the 2017-18 draft budget. Education is this Government's defining mission, and our priorities are to ensure that our children and young people get the best possible start in life, to raise standards in schools and to close the educational attainment gap. The budget focuses on these areas and reflects the strength of our overall commitment. The UK Government's approach to public spending has provided a challenging context for our spending plans. Despite this background, our overall national investment in education and skills will increase by £170 million this coming year. On childcare, we will continue to invest in early learning and childcare as we work towards delivering the increased entitlement of 1,140 hours a year by the end of this Parliament. The budget delivers an initial £60 million to support the first phase of workforce and infrastructure development needed to support this ambition. On schools, we are closing the attainment gap through increased targeted investment in schools. This budget delivers £120 million in 17-18 for schools to invest in ways which evidence tells them will close the attainment gap. This is £20 million more than previously announced and is funded from Scottish Government resources. The £120 million pupil equity funding will provide schools across the country with an allocation of around £1,200 for each pupil in P1 to S3, known to meet the national criteria for eligibility for free school meals. This is on top of the existing £50 million per annum, which already is provided to deliver targeted support to those authorities and schools in areas with the greatest of need. On higher education, for the 6th year in succession, we are investing more than £1 billion in higher education in 17-18. This budget allocation will protect the core teaching and research grants, and we will ensure that we continue to make good progress in our ambitions to widen access to university for young people from the most deprived communities. We announced the new Fair Access Commissioner on the 16th of December, and that was renowned educationalist Professor Peter Scott. We will continue to protect free university tuition for all eligible undergraduates. Capital investment will increase by 77% to support research and infrastructure investment and ensure continued investment in excellent learning environments for our students. This investment will support our universities to remain internationally competitive, to continue to be renowned for their research excellence, and will ensure that access to higher education remains based on the ability to learn, not the ability to pay. We have invested over £6 billion in further education, resource and capital in colleges since 2007. We have maintained college funding in 2016-17 and have increased it in real terms by 5.9% in this 2017-18 budget. This increase in our investment to Scotland's colleges will help them to generate opportunities for young people to improve their life chances, to generate the skilled workforce needed to secure economic growth. We will continue to maintain at least 116,000 full-time equivalent college places, equipping students with the skills to take them on to positive destinations in education and employment. We have also increased college capital funding in this budget by £20.4 million. This increased investment will, amongst other things, allow work to begin on a new campus at Falkirk for the Forth Valley College. We are investing in modern apprenticeships by increasing the number of MA starts this year as a step towards 30,000 by 2020. We will establish a new flexible workforce development fund for training needed to support inclusive economic growth. This budget also delivers £221 million to interventions that support skills, training and employment in Scotland, matching the funding transferred as a result of the UK Government Apprenticeship Levy. This includes an additional £8 million for modern apprenticeships. And these comments, I look forward to addressing comments from the committee.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Before I move on to questions, can I just remind everybody that we have a very full agenda today. We've got a lot of questions that we want to get through, so if we can make the questions as short as we can and the answers as short as are required. I'll start the questions. We're starting with a focus on school education today. One of the things the Finance Committee has asked us to look at was how public bodies work accords with the Christie Principles. The committee's done good work in the performance of the SQA and Education Scotland, and there's a strong theme of collaboration across the sector. However, the committee has not always found it easy to identify clear lines of accountability for fairly significant decisions. For example, around the structure of the senior phase. And is there a tension between Christie principles of openness and accountability and collaborative working?
I don't think there is, Convener. I think I would readily concede that the world of education is complicated. I've certainly become very much aware of that in the past 7 months. There's lots of stakeholders and perspectives that we need to take account of in taking decisions, particularly around the content, the design and the delivery of the curriculum. And that's an endeavour that involves the government, it involves our agencies, Education Scotland and the SQA, it involves local authorities, it involves the professional associations, it involves a range of other professional stakeholders, including the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland. So there are a whole range of different players. Now, the challenge is to ensure that all of that dialogue and discussion is focused in a way that enables us to have a clear sense of direction. And that is what I'm focused on ensuring is the case. In relation to the points that you relate that question to in connection with the Christie Principles, I think the importance of being open and transparent about the decisions that we take is vital. And I think we also need to focus, and this is probably the key issue that comes out for me, the key point of principle from the Christie Commission work, which is relevant in the work that I'm doing, is that we must focus on the needs of the whole child. And the child must be central to the design of the education system, and the decisions that we take must have the interests, the well-being and the progression of the child and their development at the heart of our decision-making.
Is there anything that you're working on or anything that you think could be done to improve that clear line of accountability for if something isn't working, we know where it started to go wrong?
I think I'm going to look at the arrangements around all the different bodies that we have that look at some of these questions. You know, we have a Curriculum for Excellence Management Board. We have a subgroup of that, the Assessment and Qualifications Working Group. I chair one of those. I don't chair the Curriculum for Excellence Management Group. These are arrangements I've inherited, and I'm going to have a look at that in a timely fashion to make sure that that operates in an effective way, a clear way and a transparent way so that accountability is clear. But I think we have to accept, and nothing I do about education will detract from this point, that there are multi-layered levels of accountability within education. You know, the government has some responsibility, agencies have responsibility, local authorities have responsibility, schools and teachers have responsibility, and there's various other points of accountability into the bargain. So we'll never, we will never remove that multi-layered accountability requirement, because we need different layers within the education system to be accountable and to take ownership of the responsibility of ensuring we deliver quality education in Scotland.
Okay, thank you very much, Russ.
Wiener. Cabinet Secretary, within our SPICE briefing for the committee today, it states that the budget for Curriculum for Excellence has been reduced across SQA, Education Scotland and central government budgets. Now, this comes at a time when the SQA have told this committee that they're going through an intense period of assessment redesign, which is on top of business for usual, on top of their transformation programme, with a very tight timeline to meet, and they were very clear in relation to my own question that this requires additional resource. It's also a time when Education Scotland have been charged with burning a barrage of bureaucracy, and we've received some pretty poor PISA results. So the response from the Scottish Government is to cut cash from the general curriculum by £4 million, money for qualifications assessment has been reduced by 50%, non-staffing budgets for Education Scotland by 16%. So does the Cabinet Secretary agree with Professor Lindsay Patterson that this approach is a big risk and is unwise?
No, I don't. I think we have developed the curriculum to a very advanced stage. The qualifications framework is developed equally to a very advanced stage. And yes, there are changes to the qualifications, the content of the qualifications approach that are being made, which are about rebalancing the rebalancing between the final assessment and the course assessment that's undertaken during the course year. And as a consequence of that, that's a more minor change to the process than the design of qualifications, which is the work that has been very much at the centre of the activity of the SQA for some time. On Education Scotland, I think I hear loud and clear the necessity for Education Scotland to be more focused, to reduce the volume of guidance that it generates, and that's exactly what I'm doing. And we don't need more money to reduce the amount of guidance we produce. We need to make sure that is sharper and clearer and has more impact within the system. So I think the decisions that we've taken have been robust and clear decisions. I obviously will continue to monitor all of these decisions as we go through the financial year, but I'm confident that we've taken a set of decisions that are appropriate for the stage of development of Scottish education.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Following on from that and the point about the assessment redesign being undertaken by SQA, on the 2nd of November at this committee, you stated that it is intolerable if there are errors in exam papers. Now, when challenged on this by the committee on the 23rd of November, Dr Brown said that these mistakes were happening because, and I quote, people are working extremely hard and that there is a need for the SQA to ensure that they have appropriate engagements and institutions to ensure quality assurance. And she highlighted issues with resources. So in terms of the mistakes that have been made and ensuring that with this very tight timeline that we've got, that we don't repeat them, how much of this is related to SQA resources, or how much do you think is a failure of leadership in SQA?
Well, I think the issue that Mr Thompson raises is described essentially in the letter that Dr Brown has sent to the committee dated the 16th of December, which goes through the various elements of the process of quality assurance within the SQA. And I think when you look at the 6 steps that Dr Brown marshals in her response to the committee will be able to see the processes and interventions that are put in place to make sure that quality is assured as part of this process. Now, I visited the SQA just last week, and I think it is important to remember the scale of and the number of transactions that the SQA is involved in on a routine habitual basis. It is a colossal number of transactions that all have to be accurate. I spent some time with the team who are responsible for the presentation of examination papers, and the amount of care and attention and focus on detail that goes into every single paper that the SQA puts forward is very obviously a huge challenge. So there are teams there doing that, and Dr Brown has set out, I think very clearly in her letter to the committee, the various steps that are taken to make sure that that is accurate, and that is essentially a very basic requirement of what the SQA needs to deliver on behalf of the examination system, and to make sure that that's accessible and dependable for young people who are involved in examinations.
At the same meeting of the committee, obviously colleague Tavish Scott challenged Dr Brown on the submissions from teachers, which were quite clear that they're being swamped in guidance and documentation. One submission from a teacher raised concerns about 81 pages of guidance across 5 different documents, across 3 different websites. And members of this committee did express concern that there was a danger of sinking in a sea of jargon. Part of the response to that was that there would be a transformation programme resulting in changes to the IT system, which I know, again, worried some of the members in the committee. Can you confirm the 1 million is allocated for a new IT system in the budget? From previous experience, given other IT systems in other parts of government, is this a realistic budget? And when do you believe the new system will be in place and available for teachers?
Well, these are internal systems within the SQA that are being developed, and SQA is hugely technology dependent, and that again is very obvious when you visit the SQA's operations, and you can see how technologically dependent the SQA is to process and handle the range of transactions that are underway. We've responded to the requirement for additional capital resources to support the IT developments within the SQA. IT developments are a routine part of developing the work of the SQA and ensuring its capacity can deliver for the examination system. The work that's underway is programmed work to be undertaken within 2017-18, so those resources will be available to undertake the IT improvements within that time frame. And I think there are clearly lessons that the SQA is learning, and Dr Brown has made this point clear to the committee as well, about the communication process that the SQA is involved in, and to make sure that that is as robust and as effective and as useful as it can be for teachers and for students.
Daniel Johnson.
Thank you very much. My line of questioning in some ways follows on. I mean, I think it's fair to say that this committee was quite overwhelmed by the survey results we got. I mean, there's a sort of a very clear majority of teachers who are less than satisfied with the level of support and lack confidence that the SQA and Education Scotland are really supporting the objectives. Let me just read out one quote. I think that a lot of the negative views are associated with the way in which the qualifications have been designed and implemented and the way in which they have worked. What we have done and continue to do is try to understand why they have not worked in the way that we have anticipated they would work. That wasn't one of our submissions, that was from Janet Brown. Does that quote, and indeed our survey results, not indicate that the issues faced by the SQA are not rather more serious and urgent than maybe your initial comments have made out this morning?
I think we've got to, it's very important to listen to feedback and to engage in that feedback and to listen to survey evidence. But I just want to make a point about some of the survey evidence the committee took. On Education Scotland, the committee took a survey, a piece of survey evidence which it published based on the feedback of 211 teachers in Scotland out of 50,000. 211 with comments about Education Scotland. And that was a voluntary survey. It wasn't weighted, it wasn't properly constructed as a sample, it was just 211 teachers. Now, I don't say that to belittle it, I just say it to put it into context. And we have to be careful about what conclusions we deduce from that type of dialogue.
I accept what you're saying about the education survey, but in the SQA, there was from all the various sources, we got exactly the same message.
I'm just putting this into context, Kavina, about the survey around Education Scotland and what it says about it. Now, in relation to the work of the SQA, what is the SQA's purpose? The SQA's purpose is to deliver a credible assessment framework and certification framework within Scotland to ensure that young people who are able to undertake their courses are able to obtain a reliable and credible certification at the end of that process. And in my experience, that is generally viewed to be the case within Scottish education. The SQA certification is viewed to be reliable and dependable. Now, if the process, the issues that are raised about dialogue, engagement, communication, guidance, these are all legitimate issues where I'm certain there is room for improvement in the performance of the SQA, and the SQA has to make sure that it focuses on that task and how it takes forward that challenge.
With respect, when you have the head of the SQA who are responsible for the examination saying, in essence, that the problems that they face are to do with the way that the examinations have been designed, implemented, and the way they work, which is what this quote says, do you not think that should be ringing some very serious alarm bells?
Well, I suppose it has, because we've removed unit assessments from National 5 and from Hires. So we're undertaking a programme of reform. So the point is the design of the qualifications has relied to an extent on unit assessments. And unit assessments have been judged to be, by the profession, cumbersome and duplicative in the assessment that is undertaken of young people. So I've taken action to address that point, and we're going to remove unit assessments starting in the 2017-18 diet to make sure that the assessment burden is not as cumbersome as it has been.
Again, with respect, this point was not in response to a question about unit assessments. It was in response to the examination system as a whole and the way that the SQA interfaces with teachers. So I have to say, I don't think that really pointing to unit assessments is sufficient.
With the greatest respect, I do, because I think let's look at what the relationship between the curriculum and the examinations. Curriculum for Excellence is designed in a fashion that it should not be, the performance of young people should not be solely and exclusively assessed by a final examination. That there is course assessment that contributes towards the overall performance of a young person. That's a requirement of the curriculum. The final examination is there to assess and to test particular elements of the knowledge and the learning that's been undertaken by young people. Unit assessments were also added into that to provide some further rigour in that process. And the judgment that was arrived at by the Assessment and Qualifications Group and by the Curriculum for Excellence Management Board was that that was duplicative. And I've addressed that and I've removed that. So, because nobody, in my opinion, is saying, well, we don't need the coursework assessment as part of the overall examination structure, because that's inherently part of Curriculum for Excellence. And nobody is saying we don't need a final examination because that's, I think there'd be, I could imagine there'd be, I can think of various people who might be howling at me if final examinations were removed from courses. But what I've addressed is the fact that there is a duplicative nature around unit assessments. So I'm doing that to try to address Mr. Johnson's point that when people are raising issues about the examination system, they're not questioning the coursework, they're not questioning the final examination, nor would I think it be credible to do so, because the Curriculum for Excellence requires that coursework assessment to be undertaken, and we need to have a final examination to assist in the certification process. But where there is a duplication in the system, we should be prepared to address that, and that's what we're doing.
All I'd ask you to...
Sorry, we'll have to move on. Richard, I did say it to you before the last question.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary.
Morning.
As you said in your opening remarks, education is a defining mission of the government over the next 4.5–5 years. And I certainly don't envy your task and how complex the subject is, as this committee has been finding out over the last few months. In terms of the budget scrutiny, I just wondered if you could comment on the whole issue around attainment, because clearly there's a huge emphasis on closing what's been termed the attainment gap. And I know that this is a responsibility not just of the Education Cabinet Secretary, because we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking attainment can be solved just in the classroom. This is an issue of wider social economic factors as well. And I know that the Forestry Commission fund development officers in Education Scotland. I know the Justice Ministers fund initiatives that are used in many schools in Fife and elsewhere. So across government, other Cabinet Secretaries and Ministers have roles to play. I just wondered how that's all been coordinated, or if that's something you intend to look at, so that in 4.5 years we are where we want to be.
Yeah. The policy foundations of what the government is trying to do on education are linked together by three major policy planks: getting it right for every child, curriculum for excellence, and developing Scotland's young workforce. And those three policy foundations essentially draw together the thinking and the analysis that's required within government to properly address the needs of every young person, so that if we genuinely are focused on getting it right for every child, then we have to accept that there will be educational contributions required there, there'll be health contributions, there may at times be justice contributions that are required, and we have to ensure they are aligned as effectively as possible. So one of the principal ways in which that is joint work that's undertaken within government through our public service reform work, so that we're all aligned to these priorities, and the joint working which goes on between different portfolios. But in sharing that with the wider world, because out with, if it's complicated enough within government, it's even more complicated out with government. We've drawn together the work of the Early Years Collaborative and the Raising Attainment for All Collaborative into one a venture called the Children and Young People's Collaborative, and that is about bringing together health professionals, educationalists, people from the criminal justice system, people from the third sector, a whole variety of different individuals right across the country in all the community planning partnership areas around the country, to make sure that we are part of a joint learning process, and that gives cohesion to the way in which this agenda is taken forward, not just at local level, but at national level. So the fundamental premise of Mr Lochhead's question is one that the government accepts, that there is a necessity for that work to be reflected across all areas of government. And indeed, the Children and Young People's Act of 2014 placed a requirement to develop a child's plan around in different parts of the country, to make sure that we're properly drawn together that work which brings together the activities of a range of stakeholders.
Okay, thank you. In terms of achieving the attainment gap in rural areas, I just want to raise an issue with you in terms of how we ensure the needs of rural areas are taken into account in terms of budget allocation. I know this is clearly also a role for local authorities, but for instance, I was at Speyside High School this week, and it came up in conversation that in terms of closing the attainment gap, after school clubs play a really important role. But in a rural community, and Speyside High covers the whole of Speyside, they were spending £10,000 a year on buses, because clearly if you're staying behind, you can't get the usual school bus, so extra transport has to be put on, and there's no public transport links really. They can't now spend that money because the money's not available, so the after-school club's not available to as many children as what it was before. And that's just an example of the additional challenges facing rural schools and closing the attainment gap. Clearly in urban communities, economies of scale, local transport links are better. Therefore, how can we ensure that the budgets are taking into account rural needs for closing the attainment gap, given the extra challenges facing rural communities?
Some of the issues that are involved in that question are reflected in the role of adjustments such as rurality and sparsity of population that will go into the local government settlement and the distribution of resources that essentially are designed to reflect some of these points. In relation to the attainment challenge, obviously we're moving to a situation where in 17-18 we will be channeling resources directly to schools driven by the eligibility for free school meals within those areas. So the existence of deprivation, and therefore the need to make sure resources reach all of the the instances of deprivation around the country will be much more prominent in the distribution of the resources, the £120 million that I've talked about earlier. Now, up until now, we've not been following such an approach. It's been based very much on the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, which is an effective mechanism of identifying groups and areas of deprivation, but not individual instances of deprivation, which the approach that we're taking on the distribution of the Attainment Fund resources in 17-18 will enable us to do. So we are taking, I'm very mindful of the points that Mr Lockhead raises about the importance of ensuring that there is an approach taken which supports and assists the delivery of services in rural areas which will have a different character about them compared to urban areas.
I've just got one more question, but just before we leave that theme, it would be maybe helpful to look at the issue of transport costs for rural schools, because clearly that's £10,000 that an urban school does not have to find for after-school clubs and for closing the attainment gap. But in terms of my final question, I raised with you before the potential mismatch between inclusive education and resources and additional support needs, and over a number of years how we have changed the nature of the classroom through inclusive education, but clearly this can lead to some teachers being overstretched, or schools, because if the resources are not there to ensure the additional staff are there to help with additional support needs, this can put a lot of pressure on the classroom. And I just wondered whether, again, going forward, that is something you're going to be looking at.
I'm going to look at that very carefully. We've given commitments in Parliament to do that. And again, I come back to my point about the foundations of education policy. If we genuinely are aiming to get it right for every child, we have to make sure we make the correct judgments, and the correct judgments are made for every young person. The presumption of mainstreaming has been pursued vigorously. I think there are some outstanding examples of good practice in the country where that approach to mainstreaming has had a profoundly beneficial effect on the young people with additional support needs, but also on the young people who do not have additional support needs, and enhancing their perspectives of the world and the community and their fellow citizens. But we have to make sure the correct judgments are being made, and I think we have to satisfy ourselves that that is the case. And it's certainly an issue that I know is very much to the fore in parliamentary consideration, and it's an issue that I intend to look very carefully at in the period ahead.
Thanks very much. Tavish.
Excuse me, thank you. Can I just further to Richard's line of questioning ask you to confirm, Cabinet Secretary, that the draft budget introduces a new specific grant to local authorities of the 120 million you've mentioned to be paid as a ring-fence grant as part of the local government settlement. Is that technically correct?
Yes, I think that would probably be a description.
And is it on top of the, you mentioned in your opening remarks, it's on top of £50 million that's in the existing budget. So there's actually 107, correct me, but does that mean it's 170 million for the budget next year? How's that audited?
How's it audited?
Yes.
Well, it will be audited as part of the £50 million will be, well, all of it is audited as part of the assessment of the government's accounts by the Auditor General.
Indeed, but what I'm driving at is it's audited in that sense by government. The 170 will be audited by government, not by local government, who obviously have responsibility for their own spending on education.
Well, they will be, local authorities will be receiving, within the 50 million, local authorities will be receiving some of that money directly. So it's, I suppose the best way to explain it is that it will be a shared process, because local authority, the government will be audited on the distribution of the resources to a local authority, but the local authority will be audited on the basis of how it spends that money. And the government doesn't, the government is not specifying precisely, you must, well, we'll be specifying it within grant conditions, but the local authority must operate within those grant conditions, and so must also the school operate within those grant conditions.
And therefore the schools will be accountable to you as the Cabinet Secretary for their delivery against those said grant conditions?
Certainly we would want schools to be using those resources in accordance with the guidance that we set out, which is guidance that will inform how the resources can be used to improve attainment.
You'd be prepared to share that guidance with the committee so that we can see after the year what's actually happened, or at some point what's actually happened?
Obviously, we're in active discussion with
Sure.
local authorities about these points just now, but of course, any information the committee requires on that, we'd be happy to provide.
Thank you. And further to Richard Lockhead's broader point about local government spending, at the table that all members got when the budget was given last week in relation to local government spending, so the money specifically for councils, has that been overtaken by another table? Has there been changes to that since that table was issued to members?
There was, it's after dialogue with COSLA at the end of last week, there was a revised table issued, yes.
Okay. So, yeah. In those circumstances, Michael Cook, when he gave evidence to the Local Government Committee in relation to teacher numbers, said, and I quote, on teacher numbers policy, this gives us considerably less flexibility in terms of how we employ that resource. Is that a fair observation?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. I don't think there's much secret about the fact that the government and the Scottish Government and local government have not exactly seen eye to eye about teacher numbers.
Yeah.
And local government has wanted to reduce teacher numbers, and the government has put in place the mechanisms to make sure that didn't happen. And that didn't happen in the census that we just published last Tuesday. So I don't think it's a particular secret that we've not seen eye to eye on that issue.
I think it might be fair to say some local councils have chosen to want to reduce teachers, not all by any means. But that aside, do you recognise the point, though, that there appears to some that there is an increasing direction of travel here which is leading towards government having more direct control over what's going on in education at local level? And the budget is being used to further that objective of policy.
The government has set out an approach on education improvement, which is demonstrated by the National Improvement Framework, which was first set out by the First Minister in January of this year, and I fulfilled the statutory duty that we have to publish a National Improvement Framework last Tuesday by publishing the document that I published to Parliament. And that sets out how the government takes forward its statutory responsibility to set the direction for Scottish education and to take the necessary and legitimate steps to make sure that's pursued around the country.
Okay, and within that that document that you published and spoke to in Parliament last week, there were, and correct me if I'm wrong, 6 new initiatives that I could count as I went through the proposals within that, or the plans within that document. Those resource, they all have resource, or I could read them, they all have resource implications. Would that be fair?
Well, what they're designed to do is to give direction to the way in which we take forward improvement in Scottish education, and
ask about the resource implications of those directions, Minister.
And we allocate very significant amounts of resources to enable the delivery of educational priorities around the country.
Okay, well, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ross Greer.
Continuing on the theme of local government funding, I don't want to repeat the debate that's happened since the last week on the proportion of the cut to local government, but if we're to take the Spice briefing for this meeting as a basis and take the amount that's been cut from the local government budget and assume that it would be cut proportionally from their education spending, it comes to around £106 million. I was wondering what the Cabinet Secretary thinks the impact of that will be.
Well, what I think the government has done has been to enhance the capacity of local authorities to, the spending capacity of local authorities in Scotland, and that has been enhanced by a number of different measures, whether it's about the changes that to the banding of council tax that the government has taken forward and secured parliamentary support for, or whether it's the decision the government's taken to enable increases in council tax to take place of a routine level, or whether it's the transfer of resources to to support health and social care integration. I think all of these initiatives have helped to boost the spending power of local authorities.
With respect, that's not really the question that I asked. What impact do you think the cut will have on education being delivered by local authorities?
Well, what I think's got to be borne in mind is the fact that the resources that we're putting in place come from a variety of different funding streams, and the government is putting in central government resources, yes, but we are also enabling local authorities to raise more revenue to enhance their spending power at local level, and that will have a profound impact on local authority, a profound positive effect on local authority spending power.
The issue there is that empowerment is within the constraints of a broken local taxation system. But taking that aside, the amount that's been cut, taking this briefing on board, and I think this briefing gives a more generous figure than some others from the government's perspective, it comes to roughly equal to the attainment fund, 106 million, 120 million. Is it fair then to brand the attainment fund as additional funding for local government, for schools directly, when in fact it comes to roughly the same amount as is being removed from the budget anyway?
Well, I'm just going to repeat the points that I've made already, because I'm not in agreement with Mr Greer on his analysis here. The government is putting in place grant and aid. We're adding to that financial flexibility at local authority level, which the government sought a mandate for in the election, which the government has taken through Parliament, and that enables local authorities to raise more revenue from council tax. And we're also enabling local authorities to raise the council tax by up to 3%. We also are investing resources in health and social care integration. Now, the consequence of all of that is to increase the spending power of local authorities by £240 million.
I don't think we're going to be able to resolve that disagreement, so perhaps come back in later on.
Thank you very much. Joanne?
Thank you very much. I want to say something, first of all, about the evidence that the committee heard on SQA and Education Scotland. I understand, as a Cabinet Secretary, you'd be far too busy to go and read. I wouldn't expect you to read all the detail of that. But I'm concerned that somebody in your department thought it would be a good rebuttal to count the number of survey responses and compare that with the number of teachers. And I genuinely say to ask you to look again at what teachers were saying. It took me 3 hours to read the evidence, and what came through it very strongly were genuine concerns by committed professionals that the system wasn't working. And I would urge you not to try and find, accept an official's explaining away of this, but rather to reflect on it. And I note that the justification for the cuts to the budget to SQA is it's been halved on the grounds that, quote, budget decrease stems from a maturity of the Curriculum for Excellence and completed implementation of the new national qualifications. Do you not accept that that statement is probably one that very few people in Scotland agree with? That CFE has come from a maturity of CFE, when in fact a lot of the evidence we got was a sense of huge uncertainty in the sector and amongst parents about what's happening in our schools?
Well, the first thing is that, you know, to answer John Lamont's point, I'm simply making a contextual point about the scale for responses to the online survey of the committee. But I look very carefully at feedback from the teaching profession, and I am in dialogue with the teaching profession at all levels on a very sustained basis. And so and many of my actions are driven by those conversations with the teaching profession. So when it comes to, that informs the judgment that I make about where we have reached in the process of implementation of Curriculum for Excellence, and which informs the budget decisions. CFE has been, you know, the concept of Curriculum for Excellence essentially began about 14 years ago. And
well, that's not the question I'm asking. This is about implementation and the lack of certainty amongst a whole range of people about Curriculum for Excellence. Now, you may take feedback from teachers, I accept that. The Association of Geography Teachers, I think is the title, described the paper, the exam paper, as, I think, to capture their view, it was a shambles. Now, to say it's a shambles, and for people to be highlighting to government their concerns about Curriculum for Excellence, frankly, contextualising it in the way that's been done is inadequate. Because, and this is, in some ways, is not a your door, this is about SQA and Education Scotland as well. Now, in response to questions, basically the SQA said, well, you know what teachers are like, they don't want to change. And I am very concerned that you're making budget decisions in an understanding of what the concerns are around Curriculum for Excellence, which, frankly, contextualised as being frivolous. I mean, do you accept that there is a serious question here, and that to have a budget to follow a view of what the problem is, when the problem is a lot deeper, is, as has already been said, a significant risk?
The first thing is that John Lamont used the word frivolous, and that's not a word I would use, and I want to put that on the record firmly. That's not a word I would use. I take forward very seriously my engagement with the teaching profession, and I listen carefully to the teaching profession. As a consequence of that, in August, I directed that guidance be given to the teaching profession about what I described in my own covering letter to every teacher in the country was the definitive guidance on delivery of Curriculum for Excellence, the definitive guidance. And that was to empower the teaching profession to disregard vast amounts of stuff that had been put in their way, which I accepted was duplicative and cumbersome. And I have to say, and the committee is free to go and test what I'm about to say with the teaching profession if it wishes to do so. But the feedback I've had from teachers about that guidance in August was it was enormously helpful in simplifying the guidance and the approach that the teaching profession were operating within. Now, I offer that honestly to the committee. That's the feedback I've had. And I go about my consultation dialogue with teachers in a fashion which invites them to tell me and contradict me if I'm not reflecting what they're saying to me. But that guidance has been viewed by the teaching profession that's made its views known to me as being of enormous assistance in simplifying the curriculum and the guidance that's available. Now, this is a sustained programme of ensuring that the guidance is relevant for the teaching profession. You know, what's happened over the last few years is that as Curriculum for Excellence has been rolled out, there have been calls for more clarity and more guidance, and that has been offered, and it's been offered on a number of occasions. But please. But what has happened is that has, and I've made this point to the committee and I've made it to Parliament, it's become a cumulative burden for the teaching profession, and I'm now setting about ensuring that clarity is delivered. And we've started that process, and I intend to sustain it.
Right. So the point really I was making was a question of whether, in the context of where we now are, and would accept there's been change, whether a halving of the budget is wise. But I want to ask a related matter, because I think it is round the budget. I think it's EIS, in one of their submissions, pointed out that there had been a 500% increase of certification external to Scotland by the SQA. And when we raised this with the SQA, in essence, as well, as to help balance the budget. But the concern must be that in order to deal with a shortfall in the budgets, they have to do more external work, which I would have thought would dilute the focus on the real job, which is to give confidence in the examination system in Scotland. Do you think, or would you at least look at this issue, where the SQA were clear that one of the reasons they were doing this was in order to bolster their budgets? Is that advised at a time when you're cutting the budget on, to the SQA when people still have grave concerns about Curriculum for Excellence?
There's two points in response to that. One is that I will continue the practice of my predecessors in assessing the performance of the SQA budget during the course of the financial year to determine whether or not the judgments we've made at this stage are judgments that can be sustained. And the second point is that the SQA are very clear from the guidance that they are given by ministers that international activity can only be undertaken in a fashion that does not distract from the core purpose of delivering quality accreditation within Scotland.
Okay, thank you
very much. Fulton wanted to come in with a short supplementary, then Daniel with a very short supplementary, both of you.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. It was actually going back to, I was going to come in earlier on Daniel Johnson's point, and then it sort of moved on, but Joanne brought it back. And it's going back to the survey that we've spoke about. we did get a lot of feedback in that was negative, but I actually I disagree with Joanne Lamont, and I think that the Cabinet Secretary putting it in a context today has been useful. And what I would say then is, you've got two arguments in. Are those 200 odd folk that have responded, are they talking for everybody? Or have the 95% or whatever who haven't responded, are they the majority? And I'm wondering if the Cabinet Secretary thinks that maybe the SQA doing its own sort of quantitative research on it, and amongst all the other things that obviously the SQA is doing, would be useful, because I do think that it is important that whatever teachers' views are, that it's important that they have faith in that particular organisation.
The point I'd make here is that the SQA do a significant amount of engagement with members of the public and the teaching profession about the work that they undertake. I think it's crucial that they learn lessons from the feedback that comes from that, and I know that Janet Brown and her team are committed to doing so. And the second point I'd make is that I would be the first to accept, and I don't think anyone could accuse me of not accepting this, that there has been a need to reduce the amount of guidance that is percolating around the system, and that is precisely what I am doing in response to the views and the attitudes of the teaching profession.
Sorry, Cabinet Secretary, I thought you were still talking. A very, very short supplement.
The Cabinet Secretary cast doubt on our survey results on the basis of the numbers received. And you've just said that you've had positive feedback from teachers on the basis of your improved guidance. How many teachers have you had that from?
Probably thousands of teachers, to be honest, because I'm in schools every single week, several schools every single week. I spent a lot of time at the Scottish Learning Festival, just simply walking around the festival, talking to teachers who were there and talking to them about these issues. Now, and, you know, I can see I've touched a raw nerve in the committee about the survey, but I'm simply making the point that we've got to keep in context some of the points of feedback that we look at, and make sure that we're taking a broad, comprehensive view of all of these questions.
So you can understand, I might say that again, we should view your report back of informal conversations with a similar level of caution.
What I invited the committee to do was to go away and check them. So Mr Johnson could take me away.
Daniel, we're here to ask questions. I've got a couple of things before we move on to further education and higher education. One is, just for clarification, the 211, I hope it's the last time that we hear this mentioned today, the 211 was about Education Scotland. The larger figures were about the SQA. I was at a school in my constituency just recently, and I have to be honest, put this on the record, they were very complimentary about the CFE and about they could see the impact now of a positive outcome for kids that were coming through CFE, a different attitude from them, from the others, which I thought was good, and given some of the stuff we've heard recently, I thought we should put in the record. But what I wanted to come in on is the attainment fund and the money that's going direct to head teachers, right? Will they be able to use that in such a way that, for example, I went to see a project in Glasgow, a mentoring project in Glasgow. Would schools be able to use some of the money from that fund to be able to access something that's out with the immediate education authority to bring in something like this mentoring project?
Well, you'll forgive me, Convener, if I don't give a definitive view on examples of purposes that
not
can be
necessarily
used.
that, but something
I understand the point you're making to me about the broader context of how this resource could be used to improve attainment, and I think, subject to us being confident that such measures would actually assist in improving attainment, then obviously there's flexibility for such an approach to be taken.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on to further education, higher education. I'll start with Liz.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, when Keith Brown was in front of this committee, he confirmed that it was the Scottish Government's intention to abolish the Scottish Funding Council. Could you tell us on what evidence that decision is being proposed, and also could you tell us, once it is abolished, what will be in its place?
What we're undertaking is a review of the enterprise and skills activity within government and how we can produce greater alignment between all of the different activities that are undertaken by a range of bodies. And at the conclusion of the phase 1 process, we have identified the and I think Keith Brown's letter to the committee marshals the feedback that this view is based on. The need for there to be greater and clearer alignment between the work of the different bodies in focusing on improving productivity within Scotland, and the mechanism that the government has identified to do that, based on the dialogue that's been undertaken as part of the phase 1 process, is around a single strategic board that can drive that process. And that is about making sure that our interventions and our approaches are aligned to that common purpose of improving productivity and strengthening the performance of the Scottish economy as a consequence. Now, the phase 2 of the exercise is to look in detail at the questions that arise out of that in principle view, and that's the work that's now been taken forward by the ministerial group.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will know that we asked Keith Brown if we could be provided with additional evidence to support that view, and as yet I don't think this committee is satisfied that is there. Are you satisfied that the evidence is strong to abolish the SFC and to replace it with something else?
I think the evidence is strong, yes, because I think the problem that we have is that we don't have strong enough alignment between the different aspects of our agenda that we take forward as a country. And we have a productivity challenge within Scotland that we have to take steps to try to address. We've gone through a process of dialogue and consultation to identify what would be steps that would help us to create that greater focus on improving productivity. And what Liz Smith has asked me about has been the product of that discussion. Yes, I think there is the opportunity to do that, but obviously we have to look at a lot of the detail to make sure that in focusing on that aligned agenda and improving productivity, that we take all of the correct decisions to address all the public policy questions that follow from it.
And that's in phase 2?
Yes,
okay.
That's right.
Cabinet Secretary, can I ask a few questions about the budget? Sorry.
I should also probably clarify to Liz Smith that there's no question of us abolishing the Funding Council, which is what she put to me.
But you are abolishing its board, which, as I understand it.
But I just want to make that distinction, that there would be a Funding Council role and responsibility continuing, but there is the prospect of a single board looking at the activities of all of the constituent organisations to provide that necessary alignment.
Sorry, can I just ask for a little bit of clarity on that? What you're saying, Cabinet Secretary, is that there is an overarching board that will combine the enterprise agencies and the Scottish Funding Council, but the Scottish Funding Council, as it is now, will not exist. Is that correct?
Well, it's the role that's got to be undertaken by the Funding Council as an interface with higher and further education bodies. That will have to continue, but what we are proposing is the establishment of a single overarching board to look over all of the issues that are involved in the agendas involved in these relevant bodies.
I'm not sure that's what we had before, but anyway, thank you for that. Could I just ask some questions about the budget? Professor Andrea Nolan said that this settlement does not enable recovery towards sustainable funding of universities' core teaching and research, which ties in with the observations that were made in the Audit Scotland report earlier in the year in part 2 in paragraph 4, where it was making the same point that achieving the policy ambitions of the Scottish Government are exceptionally challenging because of the Scottish budget constraints. And I stress at this point they did acknowledge that Brexit obviously has an input on that too. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with these concerns that have been raised, and the point that was made very plain by Alistair Sim at the Audit Committee of this Parliament on the 1st of December, that the university sector is facing very considerable risks because of the current Scottish budget financial situation?
Let me just work my way through quite a number of the issues that are involved here. The funding settlement for the universities for higher education is a cash increase in total between resource and capital DEL compared to the budget in 2015-16. It's 2016-17. So that's the first point. It's a cash increase in total. That's because there is a £20 million uplift in capital, and I accept that there is a £13 million reduction in resource. But within that £13 million reduction in resource, there is about £8 million which will be reduced, but we've made changes to the ability of universities to increase income, which will enable them to raise resources to replace that lost income in government funding. So the net reduction in resource is £5 million in the forthcoming financial year. Now, the Audit Scotland report published in July recorded that the overall financial health of the sector in 2014 was good. It said that universities had an income of £3.5 billion, that the sector's overall income increased 38% in real terms between 2005-06 and 2014-15, and that the sector had made an overall surplus of £146 million in 14-15, with most universities generating a surplus every year in the past decade, and the overall reserves stood at £2.5 billion. So that's the context into which a reduction of £5 million of resource has to be considered as part of an overall consideration whereby the cash resources available to universities will have increased from 2016-17 to 2017-18.
Cabinet Secretary, I don't think anybody disputes the statistics that you've just read out. That the comments from both University Scotland, particularly the exchange that Alistair Sim had with John Kemp at the Audit Committee, and also what Andrea Nolan is saying here, that in order to maintain the academic excellence and the competitiveness of the Scottish universities, which is so renowned and which obviously is a prime priority to ensure that that is maintained, that the funding settlement does not provide that sustainability. That's the issue that they're raising, and because budgets are often on a one-year basis rather than a three-year basis, they're making a very strong point that they would like to see a review of the principles which underpin funding. Is that something that you will move to ensure?
I've been having a lot of discussion. I had discussion in my previous role as the Finance Secretary, and I've had a lot of discussion as the Education Secretary with the universities about a combined and collaborative agenda to ensure they can fulfil their potential, because I recognise, and I've made it clear publicly and made it clear to the universities, the extent to which I believe they represent a significant critical economic resource and economic asset for Scotland. And I am keen to make sure that we work on an agreed agenda which will strengthen the sector in the years to come. And obviously I understand very clearly the arguments for longer-term financial settlements, but this is a one-year budget that's been undertaken, and that's it's a decision the government took in this context. There is, when I met the university, we have a higher education strategic funding group, which principally is a meeting between some principals and other officials from the university sector, and my own officials and the Scottish Funding Council. but on a couple of occasions, the Minister and I have interacted with that group. And I'm very keen to, and a lot of good work has been undertaken to get us to this financial settlement that was put in place. And these options and issues have been part of the discussion that we've talked about. So the income generation opportunity that I referred to is one that's been discussed with the Higher Education Strategic Funding Group. So I'm very keen to make sure that we proceed with an agreed collaborative agenda to make sure the universities can continue to make the strong contribution. I believe this financial settlement enables them to do so.
Okay. My final question is based around the fact, and you said it this morning in your opening remarks, that the Scottish Government has taken a decision for domiciled Scots that they will go to university on the ability to learn rather than the ability to pay. We understand that. We don't agree with it in some cases, but that's the decision that has been made. Notwithstanding that, we know that between 2010-15, the demand for Scottish domiciled students increased by 23%, and we know that there are more Scottish domiciled students at university than before. But we also know that the offer rate has only increased by 9%. In other words, because of the capped system, there are more Scottish domiciled students who are finding it very difficult to get a place at a Scottish university, and much more difficult to find it in Scotland in comparison with other parts of the UK. Do you as Cabinet Secretary still agree that the capped system is acceptable, particularly in light of some of the funding constraints that you outlined before?
I do, but I think the other point which has to be borne in mind is the fact that the participation in higher education is not just undertaken at universities in Scotland, and there's a very significant amount of higher education activity undertaken within the further education sector within Scotland. And that's where I think when we get into the points about just the comparison of participation, we have to have a more comprehensive view in Scotland than can be made as a direct comparison with England, because of the difference in routes that individuals take to secure higher education qualifications, where there's a much greater reliance on further education opportunities to pursue that than exclusively in the higher education sector, which I think would undermine the figures that Liz Smith put to me this morning.
These are universities, Scotland.
My point is about in the analysis of those figures, we have to take into account the route that individuals take through the further education sector, which is more significant within Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Colin?
Cabinet Secretary, I'd like to look a little bit at the governance around the SFC. As far as I can see, the SFC carries out 4 different functions. One is regulatory, one is funding allocation, one is policy advice to the Scottish Government, and they also seem to have a role in challenging sometimes the Scottish Government in terms of some of the decisions made. Does that seem like a good mix within one organisation? Should there be an element of separation there? Is there any problem with transparency in that mix? I think the Funding Council exercises all of those functions. It's an arm's length body from government. It is able to operate impartially. The legislation requires the SFC to carry out its role of securing the provision of high quality higher and further education through universities and colleges, and to providing advice to the Scottish Government on these and other questions. In my experience, it is able to do so, and I think the remit of the Funding Council has been pursued within that context through my experience. The element of the regulatory side of SFC has perhaps historically been seen as being a bit weak. Looking at how that could be strengthened at the moment, the regulatory side of the SFC, as far as universities are concerned, seems to be almost non-existent. And for colleges, the only thing they really do is, the only penalty they can impose is to reduce funding. And
that seems, by putting a financial penalty in place, that hits the students more than really the actual college itself. Are there any thoughts as to how to beef that up?
I think there's this gets into some territory that has vexed Parliament on different occasions in the past, because ultimately this relates to the independence of these educational institutions, and the government's view is that universities and colleges are independent institutions. They must have, to be in receipt of public money, they must have good and robust governance in place, and the Funding Council, whilst not being able to intervene in institutions, it certainly has an obligation to ensure that institutions are taking due account of the requirements of good governance as part of their process. The other aspect of the work that's being undertaken is the rollout of outcome agreements, so that there is a broader agreement about what is being hoped to be achieved as a consequence of the investment of public resources that the government is making, and what educational institutions will agree to deliver. So there's those are the type of steps that I think are consistent with respecting the fact that these are independent institutions, and those institutions have acquired their status and deploy their approach within our society on the basis of that independence, and the government wouldn't want at any stage to jeopardise that.
Turning to the budget, there's been some discussion about the way depreciation is handled within the colleges. And this year, for example, there's £30.1 million being allocated for the 2017-18 financial year to cover depreciation. Now, depreciation obviously is not a cash element in the budget, and it seems an anomaly against other accounting processes across the public sector that it is handled in this way. And the £30.1 million is being used to address shortfalls in their funding, albeit with the agreement of the Scottish Government, because they have to apply to be able to use it for specific purposes. And I just wonder, is there going to be a review of this? Can this be brought into a sort of a normal public sector financial settlement process?
Essentially, what we're dealing with here is the implications of the classification of colleges as central government bodies by the Office for National Statistics. So these are requirements not applied by ourselves, but by that wider classification discussion. Now, there is a review that is underway on these particular issues involving Colleges Scotland, the Government and the Funding Council, to try to ensure that we get to a position of what I might describe as greater clarity than these are immensely complex arrangements as a consequence of the classification decisions, and we have that review underway to try to establish how this could be done in a clearer and more comprehensible fashion.
Thank you very much. Tavish.
To Colin Beattie's questions. The four functions that Mr Beattie rightly mentioned that are the responsibility of the Scottish Funding Council, are they going to stay in one body?
Well, I think this is where we come back to the point that I was discussing with Liz Smith, that the Funding Council in its executive function will remain as the Funding Council, but we're talking about changes to board governance to provide greater alignment and cohesion of policy. So the functions would still be exercised by that executive arm of the Funding Council.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to ask some questions about the Funding Council's budget, in particular in relation to the Student Awards Agency for Scotland. If I read this correctly, in the last 3 financial years, there has been an in-year transfer from the Funding Council to SAS of about £20 million a year. And I was just wondering why that was.
that will be to provide the resources that are required for particular programmes of support as demand becomes clear during the financial year.
But it's been 3 years, it's been roughly the same amount each year. Is there not something that's gone slightly amiss with the budgeting if it always has to happen that way? Shouldn't that now be baselined into the SAS budget rather than a line coming out of the Scottish Funding Council's budget?
I think we wrestle with some of these judgments, and I wrestled with a lot of them in my former role, about whether to make baseline transfers or whether to, for clear line of sight, to establish continuity of baselines. So there's never a perfect science in all of this, but the judgments that are made here are made to reflect circumstances as they arise during the financial year, and that may vary from year to year.
I understand that.
Although I do take the point that when a pattern begins to emerge, there may be an argument for baseline transfers. And indeed, the budget does involve some baseline transfers going in different directions as a consequence of that analysis. So
would it be, just in terms of a committee or anyone's ability to scrutinise properly the funding of SAS, when a pattern's gone on for 3 years, you'd at least accept there's something that maybe needs to be looked at?
I do take the point that when patterns like that emerge, there is a point to explore.
And at this stage, during the 17 the budget we're about to go into, does the government have plans, therefore, to again follow the same pattern? In other words, to have another in-year transfer if justification.
If circumstances require it, we will have to look at that question.
But you'd accept that would be 4 years, and it's something that needs to be addressed.
I think the general point is a fair point, that when patterns emerge of this type. But if I give Mr. Scott another example, in the budget document, in the section on higher education, for example, the Funding Council table 6.06, Mr. Scott will see that the 2016-17 budget is 1027, and then there's another column that says 2016-17 budget, which says 1081. And what that represents is the product of in-year transfers to deal with medical education, for example, which happens every year, but it rather skews the numbers. So there is a judgment to be applied about what is the right moment and the right time to make baseline transfers of that type.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Roscoe.
To return to Liz Smith's first question, there have been some pretty significant concerns around the implications for research funding of moving the Scottish Funding Council into the purview of this overarching board, specifically around charitable foundations, those based down south, the Wellcome Trust being a good example, which would give less and be far less likely to give when there's a perception of being too close to government. From what you've said today, Cabinet Secretary, and from what Keith Brown had said previously, is it fair to characterise this as being that in phase 1 you decided to take this approach of the overarching board, and in phase 2 you will find out what the implications of that are?
We'll explore the detail and the implications of that decision in phase 2.
Was it responsible to take a decision and give yourself essentially no wiggle room to get back out of it, to only then find out what the damage of that decision could be?
Well, what we're looking at is what can help us to focus and direct the measures and interventions that we can make to support improvements in productivity in Scotland. That's the purpose and the drive of this reform, and that's what's led us to take the decisions that we've taken. And we will, of course, explore all of the issues to ensure that we properly and fully address any of the issues that have been raised as part of the consultation and dialogue.
I fail to see how it helps to take a decision and then look to gather the evidence about the implications of that decision. That doesn't look like a responsible process.
Well, the decision that we've focused on is answering the question which is inherent in the Enterprise and Skills Review, which is how can we strengthen and improve productivity within the Scottish economy. That's been the question that we have explored to try to take the measures to ensure that is the case.
I accept that, Cabinet Secretary, but there are other significant implications from the decision that you've taken, which you don't seem to have even looked into before taking that decision.
Well, there are other relevant policy considerations. You know, the government will not take decisions. Well, they are relevant in phase one, and they've been reflected.
So what evidence did you gather about their impact?
And they've been reflected in phase one, in the steps that the government has taken. For example, to make it clear that the independence of higher education institutions is not something that we wish to in any way affect. So the nature of that commitment then affects the nature of how we operationally take forward the announcements that have been made in phase one of the Enterprise and Skills Review. So the conclusions of phase one have taken into account a variety of different policy considerations to enable us to focus on how we can give greater attention to improving productivity within Scotland.
It seems like a worrying process, but I think the committee would benefit if you were able to provide further evidence of what implications you concluded in phase one, what the implications would be in phase one.
Well, yeah, the government will be very happy to take forward further discussions with the committee on the conduct of the Enterprise and Skills Review, and ministers will be happy to participate in that process.
Daniel Johnson.
So it's emerged that there was a £50 million underspend in the higher education budget. Indeed, University of Scotland said that news of a £50 million underspend will be concerning for universities, given that there are real-term cuts to overall teaching and research budgets last year. And they went on to say that having a £50 million right now would be a significant help in starting a climb back to sustainable funding levels. Can I just ask why this clawback took place and what your reflections on those comments from University of Scotland would be?
The first thing to say is that the Funding Council made it clear to the government that it was carrying an underspend of £50 million within its resources, and that's part of the obligation of all government organisations to be transparent about underspends that they're carrying. And it was something that I required of all government activities when I was the Finance Minister, as did all of my predecessors. And as we looked at that, we satisfied ourselves that the financial commitments that had been made to universities and colleges had been met in full. And the resources that were available to them were the resources that had been promised to them as part of the budget settlements. And essentially where the resources had been generated from was the difference of timing between the delivery of resources to the Funding Council in a financial year and the distribution to institutions in an academic year. And these are two different timescales. So the resources had been generated in that way. Every financial commitment to every institution was met in full, but there was an extra £50 million being held by the Funding Council. And I judged that that had to come back into the centre because budgets should operate on the basis that resources should be available to the government to deploy as it sees fit. And that obviously was the process that was concluded as part of the accounts, the consolidated accounts for 2015-16, which were lodged with Parliament in September. Now, in relation to the comments of University of Scotland, then I'm not surprised that University of Scotland make comments that they would like to have more money. Not many organisations have sat in front of me and asked for less money, in my experience.
If you've got a supplementary, make it very brief.
Briefly ask one supplementary comment to Ross Greer's line of questioning about scope. Indeed, I think that we understand the Enterprise and Skills Review relates to productivity, but obviously Scottish Funding Council has primarily an interest in education. Indeed, in answer to Tavish Scott's line of questioning about STEM subjects and the impact of these moves, Keith Brown said that those considerations were out with the scope of the review. So I'm a little bit confused as to where these educational aspects and elements lie in terms of this review. Are they in scope or are they not? Have they been considered or have they not?
Well, the issues are about alignment in supporting economic development within our country. Now, if you look at, for example, the research activities of our universities. And one of the things that we've been able to guarantee we've been able to guarantee a number of things in the higher education funding settlement. We've guaranteed resources for teaching, we've guaranteed resources for research, we've guaranteed resources for widening access. And the £5 million of budget reductions that we are seeking will come out of the strategic projects that are taken forward by the Funding Council. So teaching and research and widening access will be assured. But the research content of the universities has a profound impact on our economy, and the links from that to the business community are something which I certainly hear from the business community as an area of great aspiration to ensure there's more collaboration and more partnership to ensure the fruits of that research activity are felt profoundly within the Scottish economy. So that's the scope of the review and what we're trying to achieve as a consequence.
Consider the education impacts.
No, we'll be looking at a number of questions in relation to the learner journey, which again we flagged up in the programme for government, that was an issue that was material for the government to take forward, and we'll be engaging very actively with the education sector on all of those activities.
I think that's a not yet.
Gillian.
I just want to come back because I have to say that I look more broadly at what we need to achieve, and I don't put education into a silo away from industry. And would it be fair to say that the Enterprise and Skills Review has been born out of many, many years of industry and workplaces actually commenting on the fact that we are not providing people with the right skills to fill the skills gap. We haven't been having people being career ready, and that this is an actual attempt to join up both sides of the coin in actually making Scotland a more productive place.
I certainly agree with the point about the fact that we need to look at different services within a broader context, and education plays a significant role and makes a significant contribution towards our economic development. So it's vital that we establish the connections and the links that enable that to happen, and that's the purpose of the Enterprise and Skills Review, to enable us to have that more profound economic proposition that can support the development of opportunities within Scotland. And skills is a crucial part of that, and again in my dialogue with different sectors of the economy, it's a point that's made fairly frequently to me, the importance of ensuring that the skills generated within the economy are able to make that contribution to our society.
And it would be fair to say that there's been more strategic planning in Cabinet across all the portfolios, because obviously there's skills gaps being identified across a lot of the portfolios and what the government's trying to achieve, and that education is going to play a key role in that.
We need to reflect that across the Cabinet table, yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Don't you, John?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Fulton, child protection. You've got a question on child protection.
Yeah, I was just going to ask the Cabinet Secretary in relation to the debate yesterday that we had in the Chamber, the root and branch review. How does he think that will impact in terms of the budget financially on the child protection aspect and, I suppose, local authority delivery of services?
I think there's obviously, there's a very welcome opportunity for us to ensure that we properly and effectively deliver an approach to supporting looked after children arising from the debate yesterday in a way that builds on a lot of the good practice that exists within Scotland today, but ensures that we deliver better outcomes for many of these young people. And I think Parliament had a very constructive debate yesterday on how that might be taken forward. And certainly our objective is to make sure that and some of this goes back to what Richard Lockheed asked me about earlier on, goes back to how we align all of the different interested parties to focus on the needs of the child and ensure that that child is central to the support and the judgments that are made, and that we take forward a reform of the system in a fashion that will ensure that we can improve the outcomes for individuals concerned.
Yep. And would the Cabinet Secretary think that, that by expanding the root and branch review and by doing the root and branch review, that will broaden the child protection process as well for young people?
Well, I think that there's an opportunity here. If we improve the outcomes and the routes of support for looked after children, we have an opportunity to significantly reduce the caseload experience of young people within the care system, and as a consequence of that, ensure that they are better supported as part of that journey. I think some of the costs that can be associated with not focusing on the child, of services essentially just not being joined up around about a young person, is one of the issues that we want to explore within the looked after review, and to make sure that young people get the support that they require. And we think there's significant opportunities to improve outcomes as a consequence of that approach.
Thanks for that. I was conscious asking that second question that I was going to ask a further question on the child protection framework and such like, but then realise we're more on the budget, so I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Joanne, you've got...
Yeah, I mean, I think Fulton's right. Some of this is about policy rather than budgets, but just to make the observation, I wonder if you would at least reflect on this, that young vulnerable people who may be in care or may be out of care, may be moving into care and out of care, they may be at risk. How does the need to have services around those young people, an ability to respond quickly, match with a desire to drive responsibility down in terms of governance to individual schools and with a regional board? Would you not accept that if you look at the question of a young person who may be going to different schools and all the rest of it, that actually creating services in a coherent way around them can be supported by the current model of local authorities rather than the one that's been proposed?
I think we've got to take great care to make sure that the dangers that John Lamont raises as possibilities don't materialise. But equally, in my experience, and I've seen a number of very good examples of this, schools have been absolutely central to providing just the foundations of support to young people who are vulnerable and meeting their needs, and essentially being a sort of a central hub of how that support is marshalled for young people. So my experience of the schools of Scotland is that they are very focused on the well-being and the development of young people, and to make sure that young people are properly and fully and effectively supported. And I think that approach is an approach which will be of enormous assistance in making sure that we improve the opportunities and the outcomes for young people.
I've no doubt that individual schools do a lot to support individual young people. The point I'm making is that very often these young people are across a whole range of schools, and that the support services within individual schools have been reduced. The capacity for a local authority to support and have policy around this range of young people surely is enhanced by being able to work across a local authority rather than break it down into individual schools. I mean, it's a genuine concern, and I do think that you can have an argument about governance around individual children, but actually for groups of vulnerable groups, where local authority services come from social work, from housing, from all sorts of groups, how on earth can it be, is there not a risk, at least, or at least would urge you to reflect on the possibility that that group of young people who don't sit in the one school for the whole of their education, but are maybe moving around, the authorities have capacity to identify patterns, would that not be something that you should maybe reflect on?
Well, there's nothing in the governance review on education that in any way challenges the role of local authorities in exercising that essential role of acting as a corporate parent for vulnerable young people. I think the questions that we have to make sure are properly aligned is that schools interact. If schools have greater discretion and greater decision-making capability, that they are able to exercise that consistent with the way in which local authorities exercise their responsibilities for the well-being of vulnerable young people.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think that brings us to the conclusion of the evidence session on the draft budget. At this point, I say thank you to Aileen McKechnie, but I know that the Cabinet Secretary and Ms MacLeod are staying with us for the next item. We'll suspend for a few moments. Thank you. Everybody back, thank you very much. The third item is scrutiny of the Government's role in relation to the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry. Can I start by putting on record my thanks to the survivors groups the Deputy Convener and I have met over the last couple of weeks, and also my thanks to the clerks who have done a great job in making sure that we had that opportunity. We met INCAS, White Flowers Alba and FGBA. All groups have provided comments for the committee, so other members are cited on issues raised in these meetings. Before moving to questions, can I remind members and witnesses that for the purposes of the Standing Order rule and sub judice, no mention should be made to any live cases during this debate or any issues that could prejudice the proceedings of live cases. And I will move straight to questions. Mainly, I suspect the questions will come from myself and Joanne, who have met with the survivors groups. But FBGA suggested a reference group made up of survivor groups and others could usefully act as a means of promoting understanding to survivor groups of the work of the inquiry, and also advise the inquiry panel on the sensitivities the inquiry needs to take into account in its operations. Do you have a view on this suggestion from a government perspective?
I think the first thing I should say at the outset is that obviously this is a proposal that relates to the inquiry, and I want to steer as far away from expressing a view about what the inquiry should or should not do. I think in general, I think the more dialogue that happens in this whole area of policy, the better, because it creates a better understanding of some of the issues that are at stake and of concern to individuals. But obviously the decision about whether such an inquiry, whether such a reference group should be established would be a decision for the inquiry, and obviously I don't have operational responsibility to influence that decision.
And I'm going to ask you another question where you're going to caveat your response with exactly the same thing, I suspect. But we spoke to White Flowers Alba, and they highlighted the Australian model, which takes a modular approach, moving through different sectors in each module, and with a commission at the centre with oversight of issues coming from each module. Do you have a view on this approach? They seem to think that it would allow, certain things to happen at certain times.
I think that's a wider question, Convener, which, and I acknowledge, and I've looked with care at the Australian inquiry that was established. And the characterisation of it that's been given to you by White Flowers Alba is, in my view, accurate. It is a broadly based inquiry looking right across a society in Australia at the experience of a number of situations, with the ability to gather that evidence and in different areas of policy, and then to reflect on that at a general level. So I acknowledge that the accuracy of that characterisation of the inquiry in Australia. The origins of our inquiry here in Scotland were somewhat different. The origins of the inquiry essentially came from a process of examining the role of the state in the delivery of care to individuals who were in the care of the state, where the state was essentially replacing the role of parents. And when we go back to 2004, that was the basis of the apology that was given by the then First Minister to individuals who'd been ill-served by the state's exercise of its responsibilities in care. That led to an interaction process which involved survivors, which ultimately led us to the establishment by my predecessor of the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, with a remit focused on addressing the experience of individuals within care. Obviously, when I took office and with the issues that have emerged, I, in dialogue with survivors, agreed to consider whether or not we should broaden the scope of the inquiry. And as I explained to Parliament in my parliamentary statement, I was mindful in considering that point of the commitments that had been made to people who had been in care, who were expecting this inquiry to take its course and to proceed. And that if I was to have broadened the inquiry remit, as has been suggested, to something either slightly broader or as comprehensive as the Australian inquiry, we would inevitably have lengthened the timescale within which this would have been undertaken. And I felt it was unfair to those survivors who were expecting the inquiry to take its course on that focused remit in relation to the in-care system, if I were to take such a decision, which is why I decided not to do so.
Could I ask, in the context of a wider inquiry, if the module system had been used, would you have been able to use the in-care cases as a module to deal with in that way?
That might have been possible, but the inquiry was established on a different basis with a very clear and focused remit in relation to in-care. And I felt the commitment and the obligation that we should make would be to fulfil the commitments made to the in-care survivors.
Okay, thank you. I'll just touch briefly on redress, but I know that Joanne has got a couple of questions around about that. INCAS suggests redress could be considered by the inquiry itself to ensure those engaging with inquiry feel progress in their case has been made, and also to prevent them having to revisit their experiences through testimony to two processes. Do you have a view on the suggestion?
I think that question involves essentially two different elements that have to be considered. One is the principle and the details of any redress system, and then secondly, if I understand your question correctly, Convener, decisions on particular awards to people as a result of their testimony. I think it would be difficult for two such processes to be undertaken under the umbrella of the inquiry. In fact, I've made it clear to Lady Smith it's not my plan to ask her to consider the issue of redress. I think that's an issue the government has got to consider in consultation with survivors groups, which is the process that we are embarking upon. And I think we have to establish what is our approach to redress, and then, quite separately from that, to make decisions about the determination and the application of any implications of that for individuals in relation to the cases and the experiences that they have had.
One of the things that did come across when we met with the survivors groups that we met with was they all are keen on redress, but there was different. There seems to be a different criteria from each individual group about who should be able to get it and when they should be able to get it. So I do accept it's a difficult one, but it's a very important one.
Look, I committed when I last saw the survivors groups to a process which will involve Celsus at the University of Strathclyde in helping us to work our way through these questions, because there are difficult questions involved in all of this, and that's not to say they haven't to be embarked upon. They've got to be looked at. And I hope with the assistance of Celsus and the participation of the survivors groups, we can make progress on this.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks very much. On the question of redress, this is a theme that I think came from all of the groups that we met. Would it be reasonable perhaps to ask Lady Smith not so much this individual should have redress, but her views coming out of the inquiry and what that redress system might look like, and what, ask her for some recommendations around that. I know that the groups we met with said that they had already provided your officials with very sort of detailed views on redress. I wonder if you've got a timescale for responding. Like, I think people do need confidence. I accept that he's not going to be part of the inquiry, but that this sense that there is progress within government around the question of redress. At what point would you be sharing your views on what that redress system might look like?
I think the first point is that I understand the importance of addressing this issue, and I want it to be done in a timely fashion. So I want to give reassurance that that is something that we are determined to take forward. I'm reluctant to ask the inquiry to do this because I weighed up this question and I felt that it was that might be perceived as if I was passing a responsibility that government should properly exercise to somebody else to do so, which is why I decided not to ask the inquiry to look at this. Also, I didn't want to give the inquiry more questions to address, given the fact that I was wanting to concentrate their efforts on addressing the substance of the experience of individuals and to make recommendations accordingly. In relation to when I last met the survivors, which must have been the 9th of November, I think, if I've got my date correct on that, I said that, yes, it was the 9th of November, I said that we would establish a process of which would involve the government and survivors groups, and I'm going to involve Celsus in this as well, to essentially look at the proposals that have come from the survivors groups and to work our way through those questions. I reassure the committee that that's a priority that we are taking forward, and we're taking forward timiously. We've had discussions with Celsus about this, and we want to engage the survivors on that process. And it's something that I'd like to do in as collaborative a way as I possibly can do, to try to make sure that we address properly the issues that have been raised by the survivors groups in the different propositions that they've raised with us.
Are you open to the option of interim payments, given the nature that many of the survivors are very elderly? And
I think it's a material question in how we take this forward. I should probably add also that although I've said that I've not invited Lady Smith to to look at these questions. Ladysmith would be free, of course, to make whatever comments she wished to make about this. So there's nothing that inhibits Ladysmith from making those points.
Okay, can I maybe go on to this question of the remit? And there's clearly a range of views on this, and I think probably the most compelling argument against extending the remit is timescale and, you know, ending up trying to do everything and failing to do anything. But would you accept, at least, that when you talked about the role of the state in terms of young people in care, what survivor groups have also flagged up to is the extent to which other parts of the system then let them down, whether it was the police or the prosecution services, and the sense in some areas that, you know, that there's been a cover-up and this is something that's not unique to Scotland. Is the inquiry able to go where the evidence takes it round, not just what happened to young people in care, but the way in which the system then closed down concerns that were being expressed?
My view is yes, because the inquiry has to look at the experience of young people in care, and that's the extension of the remit that I made just in November was to make it clear beyond any doubt that, for example, if a young person was in care and they were abused out with the boundaries of that care home, that abuse should be considered by the inquiry. That had to be part of its scope to make that absolutely clear. Now, I think the wider understanding of what happened, how issues were considered, what was done, and more appropriately what was not done at the time, all of that must be within the scope of it. All of that is within the scope of the inquiry, and in my view must be examined. And you know, that requires you know, a whole range of different bodies to be engaged with the inquiry on these questions, and the inquiry has the powers to make sure that is the case.
It would be able to look for, I mean, I think as a society we're more comfortable with the idea, and I use comfortable in inverted commas, with individual predators, but the idea that there could be organised abuse, which then involved other parts of the system as opposed to just the individual place where children were placed in care. I think that's an area that certainly organisations would hope that the inquiry could look at.
I think that's entirely within the scope of the inquiry.
Can I also just, a couple of other points, and I'm grateful for your indulgence, Convener. You have met with survivors group, and I think, you know, certainly again it was reflected in our meetings when people appreciated that, particularly I think the meeting in July, when I think survivors felt they'd been blindsided, this had happened, and you know, you've kind of followed on from that. We've had a submission from Open Secret who say they have a number of clients that work with them in terms of their support needs, who would also like to be part of that process, who would like to have the opportunity to meet with you now. I accept the constraints on your diary, but I wonder whether there is a means by which you're able to hear from other groups than the ones you haven't already heard, and we could say, you know, I'm sure Open Secret would be happy to liaise with your office in that, but just it's a very difficult balance, but it's the extent to which you are able to test it with survivors, individual survivors, what's going on within reasonable capacity for you. But I hope that you would look at that question.
I'm very happy to engage as much as I can, and I was grateful Joanne Lamont attended the meeting that she refers to in July. I was grateful for her presence on that occasion because I think her characterisation of the mood of the survivors at that time was absolutely accurate, and I've obviously worked over the summer to try to address that to the best of my ability. I've also, there's about 3 principal groups that I have been meeting on what I would call a regular basis. I've also met other individuals, aside from that, who have just asked to see me, and I've spent time listening to their experiences to absolutely test that I had the full understanding that I needed to have in making the decisions that I've made. I will be happy to meet others, so I'll take steps to address the issue that Joanne Lamont's raised.
I think some of this issue will be around what the nature of support is for survivors as well as the inquiry.
And I should also, just for completeness, I should point out that some of these questions I will need to involve other ministerial colleagues in, because there is essentially there are 3 of us who are involved in this area of policy. Annabel Ewing has the responsibility around the limitation bill. Maureen Watt carries the responsibility around some of the survivors' funds, and obviously my portfolio sponsors the inquiry. I would like to assure the committee, as I've assured survivors, that the 3 ministers are working very closely together in making sure that the decisions that we take and the evidence that we are hearing enables us to be acting in a joined-up fashion.
I think there's a question of visibility around progress, so I think if we were getting some public statement around redress, that would help. But I wonder if you agree with me that there needs to be some kind of progress statement by the inquiry around, I think there's a sense some survivors have been interviewed, we're not clear how many, we're not clear at what stage the inquiry is, and I think that would give people some confidence. A number of the groups have said they felt they didn't really know what was happening. And my final point was, I understand that the Scottish Government has said they don't want to extend the remit to, as particularly INCAS would argue, around those for a duty of care. This has been highlighted as an issue, obviously, because of the revelations that are now coming out around sport, and particularly in football. Can I simply ask if you're willing to remain open-minded, if not to attach it to this inquiry, to look at the possibility of a further inquiry on this question, specifically around young people who were abused, where there was a duty of care?
On the first point about the progress of the inquiry, if Joanne Lamont will forgive me and the committee forgive me, it's really a matter for Lady Smith to express her view about as to what information she considers it appropriate to share. And Lady Smith gave some information the other day on the about the arrangements for hearings in January, and obviously we will hear more from Lady Smith in that context. On the second point that Joanne Lamont raises, obviously this is an issue that I've thought about long and hard, and I came to the view that the inquiry that we had commissioned should remain focused on the questions that essentially had given rise to the origins of that inquiry, which were the public apology in 2004. And as we've seen the terrible revelations emerging, most recently about football, but there are of course other situations that have emerged. Particular inquiries have been set up. The Catholic Church established a review body on these questions and invited the former moderator of the General Assembly, Andrew McClellan, to explore these issues. And I also saw the next stages of that process being taken forward by Baroness Helen Liddell, who I thought wrote a deeply personal and effective and impactful article about the aspirations that she has to take forward in relation to the Catholic Church in the Herald just the other week there. And in a sense, I thought Baroness Liddell's article, in a sense, made the point more effectively than I could, that she was making the point that as a member of the Catholic Church, and I don't have the article in front of me, but Baroness Liddell said something like, I don't really want to have to do this, but I feel I have to do it because the Church has been so damaged by what has been said, what has happened. And to me, that is it's an example of how these issues can be taken forward within a particular organisation that's got a duty to address these points. And I take the same view with football. But there has to be confidence in the process that is taken, that is advanced. It has to be done with independence. It has to be done with authority to give people confidence in that process. Now, there may well be issues that emerge from these processes that the government has got to take into account. And I certainly give the assurance to the committee today that the government will do exactly that as we look at these issues.
So you would keep an open mind to the possibility of a separate inquiry on these questions? The reason I ask that is because I think there's a question of confidence among survivors, that it's and I say this genuinely, that, you know, I haven't read Helen Liddell's piece, and I'm sure it would be very thoughtful, but there's a sense in which an organisation, whether it's football or whatever, feel that they're now so damaged that they have to address the question is slightly different from there is a huge injustice going on here, how do we address that injustice? And we have all wrestled with whether there should have been a public inquiry in relation to in-care survivors, and it ultimately came down to this issue of confidence of survivors themselves. So all I ask at this stage is, would you be willing to remain open-minded to the possibility that there would need to be an inquiry which wasn't by the individual organisations, but might be informed by those individual organisations' inquiries into that broader question of the breach of duty of care. A school teacher is employed by the state. If that school teacher abuses a child, there is a responsibility on the state. And if there's a failure there, we can see that. All I'm asking is that at this stage you would keep that option open.
I think I cite the examples that I cite because I think it's important that I agree entirely with John Lamont on this, that the approaches that are taken are required to ensure that justice is done. And of course, I haven't said this in the course of my evidence to the committee today, but there is, of course, the importance of criminal prosecution within all of this that must be considered as a first step in all of these issues. So I set out my point of view to make sure that organisations address the issues that have to be addressed from the perspective of the justice of individuals that have been so ill-treated. But that has to be done with independence and authority to give confidence to survivors, because I accept totally that survivor confidence is crucial in this process.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just finish off by asking you a question about the panel membership, Cabinet Secretary? Can you explain to the extent that, to which you consider the assessors can contribute to the inquiry process now that we've gone from 3 to 2 and there's going to be more use of?
There's obviously an option for Lady Smith, if she so chooses, to appoint assessors to assist her in the task that she has got to undertake for specialist input. My judgment, having discussed the issue of panel membership with Lady Smith, was that that option gave her the flexibility that would be required to take forward the inquiry, and that there was no necessity to add a third member to the panel. And obviously Lady Smith will make judgments about that and will make public comments appropriately.
So Lady Smith has got a free hand to...
The law provides that for Lady Smith to undertake that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. In that case, can I bring this session to a close and thank you both for your time. This morning is a very lengthy session, a very useful session. Thank you. And that's a public session closed.